All right, it looks like we have a lot of people who have joined. We are so happy for you to be with us today. My name is Tom Fazzini. I am the Communications Director at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Welcome to our discussion of plastic pollution today. The Alliance for the Great Lakes is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is working across the region to protect our most precious resource, which is the fresh, clean, and natural waters of the Great Lakes. One of the threats to those waters that we're tracking closely is plastic pollution. To give you an idea of the problem in the Great Lakes, one of our signature programs is our Adopt a Beach cleanups that happen on all Great Lakes shorelines. Our volunteers log data about the litter they collect. An analysis last year of 20 years of that data shows that 86% of the litter we collect is either fully or partially composed of plastic. We know that that plastic never fully goes away. Instead, it breaks up into microplastics that infiltrate our waterways. And researchers have found microplastics in the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe. What can we do about it, and what do we know about it? Well, that is what we are here to learn more about today. We have a great panel. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Tim Hoellein, who's a professor at the Department of Biology at Loyola University of Chicago. His research focuses on pollution in urban waterways, sources, fate, and biological interactions. We're also going to hear from Dr. Chelsea Rochman, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Toronto. She runs a research lab focused on the sources, fate, and effects of micro and macroplastic pollution. And relevant to our discussion today, Chelsea also recently co-chaired a working group for the International Joint Commission, which advises on Great Lakes issues, on microplastics. And there was a report that they released earlier today that she'll be earlier this year that she'll be updating us on today. We're also going to be hearing from Andrea Densham, who's a senior policy advisor to the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Andrea has been working to advance sustainable environmental policy across the Great Lakes Basin, is a policy expert with over 2.5 decades of experience working with government leaders across the region at a local, at a state, at a national, and an international level on this and many other issues. We also will be joined shortly by Illinois State Senator Laura Fine, who I will introduce at the time she joins us. The way that this discussion and webinar will be formatted today is we will hear from each of our panelists briefly to give us a little bit of background, and then we are going to have ample time for questions. The way you can ask your question is by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can in the course of this discussion today. There's been a tremendous amount of interest. We have over 200 people on the call, and I think that's really exciting, and I look forward to diving into those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tim Hoellein. Tim.
Hey, all right, thanks. I got it up. Can you hear me okay and see everything?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Great. All right, thank you everyone for coming on and for your interest and your action today. I'm going to go over some terms and talk a little bit about the plastic that we're finding in some of our research. So we use that term plastic, and it means a lot of different things. So if you look at something plastic in your vicinity, maybe it's your computer or a pen or the desk or your clothes, whatever it might be, that plastic is made of many different things. The structure, the skeleton of the plastic is what we call a polymer. This is a long carbon chain of atoms that's ultimately derived from fossil fuels. And that's kind of like the skeleton around which the product is built. Inside of those bones are a bunch of chemicals. These are additives. They give the product different properties like color or flexibility or heat resistance. And those chemical additives are not always bound chemically to the plastic polymer, and they can make up to even about 50% of the mass of the finished item. We, of course, use plastic for a zillion different things in our lives. It's a ubiquitous part of our kind of culture that we live in our production and our purchasing, as well as our disposal. And in the environment, we characterize plastic litter through multiple different aspects of its features. We characterize plastic by size, by shape, by color. And in the environment, plastic can associate with other pollutants that are already there, things like oils or heavy metals. We use the term macroplastic to refer to the big stuff, the large items we can see readily. The cutoff is 5 millimeters, so this is maybe like the width of a pinky nail. Macroplastic comes from lots of different pathways of littering and mismanaged waste. Plastic is also a feature of our wastewater treatment system, as well as our stormwater treatment systems. And we have plastic in our sewers that finds its way to the ecosystems around us. And once out there, plastic is really moved around very readily through the action of water and of wind. Microplastic is a term you hear a lot, and in our sort of vocabulary is defined as 1 micron to 5 millimeters. So some of these would be invisible to the naked eye, and some you might be able to see at the large end. There's many different sources of microplastic. One source that you can see with the naked eye are these pre-production pellets or nurdles. These are 2 or 3 millimeters, and these are items that are used by plastic manufacturers to make larger plastic items. They're the raw materials for plastic production. But many of the microplastics we find in the environment are fragments. They're pieces of larger plastics. So here's a picture, for example, of fragments that are being generated from really common single-use plastics for food and drinking items. The fragmentation occurs through mechanical abrasion, through sunlight breaking them down, through freezing and thawing. And ultimately, one larger plastic item, like a lid to a drink, can break down into many, many, many small microplastics through those natural environmental processes. One critical fragment we find in our urban areas are tire particles. A lot of our tires, almost all of our tires, are made from plastics, and they break down when the tires are littered, but also they break down when the tires are being used by the cars, and these little pieces of tire wear can find their way into our water bodies. Plastic is a feature of our wastewater treatment system, especially through our textiles. We don't always think about it this way, but we wear a lot of plastic, things like acrylic or polyester. When a fiber breaks off of that textile, it's a piece of plastic. It's really common in our washing machines, for example, and those little pieces of lint or pieces of plastic textile can find their way through the wastewater treatment systems and out into the environment. Plastic is pretty commonly used in agriculture as well. One of the key sources are biosolids. These are fertilizers that are derived from wastewater. And because they're derived from wastewater, they have microplastic in them as well. And when they're spread onto agricultural fields, they then become a source of microplastic to the environment. And finally, microplastic is in the air. Both indoors and outdoors, there are small pieces of plastic that are held aloft and spread around the world through wind. One of the big questions in the field of research around plastic pollution is trying to come up with a budget to figure out how much plastic is out there in globally, but also in particular places. And some of the early estimates for plastic pollution entry into the Great Lakes estimate about 10,000 metric tons or so a year of plastic are coming into the lakes. So if it helps put this in context, if a car is 2 tons, that's about 5,000 cars worth of plastic in all those different forms that might be entering the lakes. But it's worth pointing out that these estimates always require some resolution. And so we need greater kind of spatial and temporal resolution on these numbers. So it's a region of the world that's experiencing a lot of plastic pollution, but the Great Lakes also produce a lot of plastic. This is a website that tracks plastic production facilities. This is just on the US side for this website, but you can see there's little dots there to indicate nurdle production facilities or parent companies of the nurdle production facilities, or those that have registered as plastic resin manufacturers. And you can see they're kind of spread out in the region, but many of these are right on the lakes, or are at least are in watersheds that are feeding into the Great Lakes. So where is it? And I'm sorry, what kinds of microplastic and macroplastic are we finding? there's a lot of research out there that works with data generated by volunteers, by community groups, and by researchers to try to really get a handle on what kinds of materials are common. This is just one example. This is a project we did with some kayak volunteers that were picking up trash in some different habitats locally, so a seawall, some vegetation. And these are the kinds of macroplastics they were collecting by category. And what we find is about 75% of this is just a few items, fragments, food wrappers, bottle caps, and bottles. In addition, there are lots of other single-use plastic items that are very common in these data sets, like straws, bags, smoking-related packaging. This is very consistent with many of the other projects that we've done and others have done in the region. For microplastics, we characterize them, like I said, all sorts of different ways by polymer type, but also by shape. So here's some of the common shapes of items that we see out in our waterways. I put together just a quick figure here of some studies that have looked at microplastics according to shape in our region. And the common shapes are fragments. These are just sort of amorphous pieces generated from larger items. We also find those pellets. These are from the pre-production pellet category, or potentially those that were added to soaps or personal care products. And then really, oftentimes the most common type of microplastic we find in our waterways are fibers, and these are generated from textiles. All right, so where is it? A common feature of our analysis of micro and macroplastic is that it's unevenly distributed in the environment. It's patchy or it's clumpy, and it's really typically grouped together with organic matter. So this is a picture of a beach, and you can see here's the water over here, but a lot of the trash and organic matter like leaf litter and wood and algae is stranded up here from the most recent storm, and the plastic and other trash is following that same pattern. In the open water areas, or in the kind of still water areas like marinas or bays, we find aggregations of organic debris, rafts, we call them, of sticks and leaves and algae, and we find the macroplastic is really stuck in those rafts as well. And then, of course, it gets into these obstructions. So this is a naturally occurring debris dam formed by a large log, and there's lots of other organic matter in there. And we find this is a hotspot for all of our trash as well. The same kinds of things go on for piers and bridges and other obstructions, both in the lake and in our rivers. Okay, so from here, I'm gonna pass it over to Chelsea Rochman to talk about the impacts.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how the plastic that Tim talked about interacts with organisms. And I'm going to focus mostly on microplastics because I want to talk about the IJC, or the International Joint Commission report that we just put out from the work group just a few months ago. So we know that microplastics are interacted, or that organisms are interacting with microplastics. And in fact, more than 1,500 species have been reported to eat these plastics globally. So what does this mean for the Great Lakes? So I'll tell you this by telling you a bit of a story about my career trajectory. So Tim, you can go to the next slide. So over the course of my career, I have sampled microplastics, or I've sampled fish to look at microplastics in their stomach. And when I started my career, I did my first research cruise to the North Pacific Garbage Patch in 2009. And here we found microplastics, maybe a couple pieces, in 1 in 10 fish. Then after my PhD, I started my postdoc. I sampled fish from off the coast of California from a fish market, and I found a few pieces in 25% of fish. I moved to Toronto, where I work now at the University of Toronto, and I started sampling sport fish from our Great Lakes with our governments, and I find microplastics in 100% of fish. And sometimes I find hundreds of pieces in an individual fish. So the next slide shows actually some of this data. So here is some data from then an undergraduate student, now a grad student, Madeline Milne, who was taking fish that were sampled from the Ministry of the Environment's Sport Fish Program in Ontario. So these are brown bullhead, largemouth bass, northern pike, rock bass, smallmouth bass, and white sucker. And you can see the number of particles per fish of microplastics. And here you can see that the median is sometimes around 100 per fish. and that one fish had more than 1,000 pieces in its gut content. And if Tim clicks on the PowerPoint, you'll see that we also see microplastics in the fillet, the part that we eat. So in our Great Lakes, as Tim just showed you, we certainly have our own microplastics problem, and they are certainly being interacted with by organisms. So if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about impacts. So we know today that microplastics can impact organisms, and we know that these impacts can be physical or they can be chemical. Now, here I show you a picture of macroplastics and how they can entangle an animal. But when it comes to microplastics, the physical effects can be filling up the gut content and then making it so they're eating less nutritional food, which can cause decreases in growth or reproduction or even mortality if they starve. And there can also be these chemical effects from the chemicals associated with plastics, for example, as additives like flame retardants or even PFAS. So if you go to the next slide, I'm showing you two species sensitivity distribution models, which are what we are supposed to use, by governments for risk assessment. It's considered the gold standard. And the first thing I just want you to notice here is that every dot is a different species. And those are the species where people have done toxicity tests and demonstrated an impact from microplastics. So every dot is about the average concentration at which an effect was found. And you can see that concentration on the x-axis. And so a species sensitivity distribution is just a distribution of the effects by these organisms on the plot. And so, for example, 50% of species affected on the y-axis, if you draw a line across, shows you 50% of the points that are covered by 50% of the organisms on the graph. But these distributions or these curves, these models are what are supposed to be used for species or for risk assessment in both countries, the United States and in Canada. So we used these to try to look at risk in our Great Lakes. So if you go to the next slide, the things that we tried to do with our International Joint Commission work group is to say, all the stuff Tim already shared with us, we know microplastics are found in our Great Lakes, across our Great Lakes. Everything I just shared, we know that there are studies that show that there can be risk or effects from microplastics. So we need to have monitoring protocols put in place for monitoring programs, and we need to have risk assessment and management frameworks we can use to contextualize that data and figure out when we need to act and how we need to act. So the next slide shows our working group that was brought together and basically what we did. And we actually worked in collaboration with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, which also led a very similar work group about a year and a half prior. Within these work groups, we have come up with laboratory methods to quantify and characterize microplastics to create standardized methods that can be used across the Great Lakes or the globe. Standardized sampling methods for how you would sample microplastics in different sampling matrices like sediment or water or animals, and a risk assessment framework that can be used in different places. So in the IJC work group for the Great Lakes, we used the State of the Great Lakes reporting framework, which is under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So we try to make sure that these risk assessments are contextualized to this place. So the next slide will actually show you what we came up with in terms of products and the website where you can find our report, which provides a database for the amount of microplastics in the Great Lakes across different sampling locations, those protocols for monitoring, as well as the risk assessment. But what you really want to see is the next slide, which is our risk assessment for the Great Lakes area. So here we created a species sensitivity distribution with organisms relevant to our Great Lakes. And we sat around a table with stakeholders that were relevant and asked them what they thought should be these thresholds that would kick our lakes from good status to fair status, or a threshold 2, which would kick it from a fair status to a poor status. This is exactly how they basically use different indicators to figure out the health of the Great Lakes every 3 years through the State of the Great Lakes reporting. Microplastics is not currently a sub-indicator, but for example, other chemicals are. And so basically this could be used if microplastics was considered a sub-indicator of Great Lakes health. So we decided on a hazard concentration where 5% of the species were affected in our SSD and 30%, and you can see those concentrations there. And on the next slide, I'll show you how that sort of lines up with samples in the Great Lakes. So you can see the samples for each lake. They're plotted as a different color of line. So for example, Lake Ontario is in a maroon color. You can see the concentrations that have been reported on the x-axis and the cumulative frequency for that concentration, for example, on the y-axis. And the thresholds are plotted against there, threshold 1 and threshold 2. And you can see that several concentrations or several samples in Lake Ontario, as well as in Lake Michigan, cross both thresholds 1 and 2, suggesting that we do have realized risk right here at home in our Great Lakes. So if you go to the next slide, our working group made some recommendations after putting out the report or within the report, which is we need to develop a regionally coordinated monitoring program so we can continue to understand the trends for microplastics across our Great Lakes. We need to support continued research to improve monitoring methods and risk assessments. We always need to understand more, so continue to support the science. The biggest thing is under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, adopt microplastics as a toxic chemical sub-indicator to be included in State of the Great Lakes reporting and as a chemical of mutual concern to trigger basically the monitoring and the risk assessments, which will all inform the prevention of emissions of plastic and reduce plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. The next slide, I believe, is my last slide and Tim's last slide. So thank you very much, and we look forward to answering questions in the discussion.
Thank you so much to both Chelsea and Tim for that presentation. I see we are now joined by Senator Laura Fine, who I briefly introduced at the beginning, and I will be giving a better introduction to this time. Welcome, Senator Fine. Thank you so much for joining us. Senator Fine is a champion on plastic reduction policies in Illinois. She has served in Illinois Senate since 2018 and is the lead sponsor of Senate Bill 1531, which would prohibit the sale or distribution of polystyrene foam food containers, commonly known as styrofoam, across Illinois starting in 2030. She is also recently elected chair of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Legislative Caucus, whose mission is to create policies to restore and protect the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River Basin. Senator Fine will be giving us some remarks about the legislative side of addressing the plastics pollution issue. Then we'll have some brief remarks from Andrea, and we'll get to those questions. Again, I'm seeing some great questions come in. You can ask those in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for talking about this issue. We have one set of Great Lakes and we got to take care of them because this is our future. So the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus is a group of bipartisan, bicameral legislators from the Great Lakes states and the provinces in Canada who border upon the Great Lakes. And like it was explained, our goal and duty is to care for these lakes, to make sure they are there for clean drinking water, for us to enjoy recreationally, for us to be able to use for business purposes. So we really work together. And it's very fascinating because the fact that we are binational. And some things that we might feel strongly about here, the Canadians might feel differently about, but we all have to come to the same page. And so within the caucus, we also have something called the Burkholz Institute. The Burkholz Institute is named after one of the founders of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, who was a state representative, or I'm sorry, state senator in Michigan. And it was her goal to be able to preserve the lakes for future generations. So what the Burkholz Institute does is every year it picks out one particular issue and it studies intensely that issue, again, with that bipartisan, bicameral, binational group. And the information that comes out of that group really ignites legislation in different states. But we know if one state is doing it, we have to get others to come along because of the fact that we all use the same bodies of water. So a few years ago, the Burkholz Institute studied plastics in water. And learning more and more about it, we talk more about styrofoam and polystyrene products. And Andrea, who's on the call with me now, has been my hero on this legislation because she really worked with me explaining and helped to explain to my colleagues what the dangers are of styrene and polystyrene in our environment and in our waterways. So we have been working on this particular bill for, oh gosh, I want to say about 4 years. A couple of years ago, we passed the first part of the legislation, and the first part said that state agencies cannot use styrofoam products. This was a big step because this also included our state universities. And when we realized, okay, it's going pretty well and the sky didn't fall, we talked about expanding the issue. And so this year, we really, really worked hard to pass a complete ban throughout the state of Illinois. And we landed in a spot of compromise, although, many of us would like to get it done today. We have to give businesses the opportunity to prepare. So the legislation that we passed in Illinois out of the Senate last week, and that's now in the House, says that you can no longer sell or distribute polystyrene products in the state of Illinois after 5 years. We gave it 5 years to give it a clean break. We wanted to make sure that especially small businesses had the opportunity to prepare, and also for companies that might make these styrene products, give them the opportunity to come up with more new, innovative, environmentally friendly products that they could put on the market. I would say the major pushback we had on the bill was from industry, and also there were concerns about loss of jobs if we say you can't sell styrene products in the state of Illinois. We addressed that saying when we passed CEJA in the state of Illinois, there is funding there to re-educate workers to go into different jobs. And that's something that can be utilized within this legislation. And we also wanted to make sure that we have a safe path forward. Even though it says that they cannot sell or distribute it in Illinois, it does say that they can still make the product and sell and distribute it out of state. The hope is I want to say the 12th state to ban it. Plus the European Union and so many other countries, that styrene products will no longer be on the shelves. Very interesting because I know there's a lot of fast food restaurants who will no longer use styrene products. I've heard one of the fast food giants is going to help get the bill over the finish line in the state house because they feel it is so important. And I also learned that there are some hotel chains that have franchises, and in those franchise agreements, it said styrene products cannot be used within your franchise. So it's very exciting. It is another step in our path towards eliminating single-use plastics in the state of Illinois. Last session, we passed another bill that said hotels and motels can no longer use those small bottles of shampoo. And what was great was we had the hotel motel industry working with us on that legislation. They know it is the responsible thing to do, and it also saves them money because it's more cost effective to have the larger containers that can be refilled than to give everybody the plastic bottles that ends up as waste in our waterways. This session, there are some other legislators who are focusing on things like PFAS, and other ways that we can cut down on plastics and chemicals in our waterways. And so with that, I'm going to send it back to you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Senator. I am now going to turn it over to Andrea Densham, who works with the Alliance for the Great Lakes as a senior policy advisor, who can talk about these advocacy efforts at all levels. Andrea.
Thank you so much. It is a true honor to be here with not only Senator Fine, and let me say, as someone who works federally and at the state and municipal level, working with a senator like Senator Fine is a true honor, and not always the case to have someone who is both so smart and so hardworking. So thank you, Senator, for your dedication to this issue, your dedication to the Great Lakes. But I think generally in our region, we have many, many members, in addition to Senator Fine, who are working incredibly hard to protect our Great Lakes. The Alliance for the Great Lakes works across the Great Lakes Basin, as Tom has talked about. And Chelsea and Tim are two researchers that really help us understand what the problem looks like and help us build a pathway forward and give us really good science and educational knowledge to be able to point in the right direction. I'm gonna pull out just a little bit from what Senator Fine was talking about in the state of Illinois to give you a little bit of a framing of what's happening across the Great Lakes Basin. And then we can jump back into a couple of more specifics about what's happening here in Illinois. Last year, we were really excited to see extended producer responsibility bill passed in Minnesota. So what extended producer responsibility bills do is hold the people that make the products that you heard Tim and Chelsea talk about, as well as Senator Fine. The folks who make that stuff are then responsible for managing it and making sure that it's contained, and that we have systems both at the beginning and end of life to make sure that it's not ending up in, polluting our waterways and is managed and maintained the best way. Our friends on both the East and West Coast and in the Great Lakes Basins, we have friends in Quebec and in Ontario who have very functioning EPR systems. So Ontario and Quebec have been doing this actually for quite a long time. And one of the nice things about being able to work binationally is we get to learn from them. So very excited to see extended producer responsibility moving in Minnesota, which means that we are hopeful about moving it forward across the rest of the basin. In Illinois, 2 years ago, we were able to pass a bill that initiated a needs assessment process. So the Illinois EPA just created a contract with a needs assessment company that's going to be able to start an extended producer responsibility needs assessment in Illinois. So that's going to move Illinois a little bit forward on that. And our friends in Michigan have an entire suite of bills. In fact, one of the bills is structured and based on the IJC report that Chelsea Rochman just talked to you about. So, and in Michigan, they're working very, very hard to address things like pellets and microfibers, as well as monitoring bills. Back here in Illinois, we've been able to have quite a bit of success this session. And that comes from years of work. I mean, Senator Fine talking about how long it took to get here, I think is really important. And the reason why we got here and we're able to gain success and being able to pass bills at the state legislative level is because researchers like Chelsea and Tim have been able to lay out a really clear description of the problem. We at the Alliance and many of our partners across the basin, across the country, have been able to educate folks. We've been able to have volunteers at our cleanups to be able to illustrate the challenges and the problem. And we've been able to inspire folks to help us take action. So here in Illinois, not only are we moving forward with a foam foodware ban, which again passed out of the Senate last week. Hopefully this week, we're going to see a plastic bag bill come up in the state Senate in Illinois. We also have a pre-production plastic pellet bill that those pre-production pellets that you heard Tim talk about. We have a bill that's moved out of the House. It's going to the Senate. Going to be coming to see Senator Fine's chamber, and it's going to instruct the Illinois EPA to create regulations to ensure that those really toxic plastic pellets don't find their way into our waterways and eventually to contaminate our drinking water, which is the worst of the worst possibilities. We also have a skip the stuff bill that's already moved out of the House, which means all that extra stuff you get in your to-go containers won't be finding its way. So now it's on its way to the Senate. We hope that the Senate will be able to pass it. And we also worked really, really hard on a microfiber bill. I saw a question earlier on microfibers. We're seeing innovation happening, and this is also something we can talk more about later, but we're seeing technology as we've been able to identify the problems. We've been able to see innovations in technology, and in partnerships with the business sector, we've been able to see the business sector actually move forward and find innovative solutions to problems. So one of those problems is those microfibers that Tim talked about come off of our clothes or our bedding and end up in our wastewater systems and in our drinking water. And one way to prevent them from getting there is to capture them by filters in our washing machines. We're seeing some washing machines in the United States being built with them inside the machines. And we're also seeing manufacturers both in Minnesota and in Ohio, Filtrera in Minnesota and Clear in Ohio, be able to put aftermarket filters on that prevent almost 90% of those fibers from making their way in. The bill that we were working on in Illinois hasn't made its way through the legislature, but we're going to keep fighting and we keep working. And we really do think that public-private partnerships with those folks finding smart innovations on things like filtering out wastewater systems and identifying the challenges at the earliest place, so we're preventing the pollution before it enters our wastewater systems or our drinking water, is really, really important. And I want to, the one last thing that I want to talk about is some of the combination of things that we're doing here in Illinois and in Michigan to recognize the relationship between PFAS and microplastics. There's a brand new PFAS and microplastic wastewater Citizen Protection Act, a bill that is moved out of the House in Illinois. It's going to go on to the Senate. And it establishes a PFAS and microplastic wastewater Citizen Protection Committee, and we'll create an action plan within a year. And we think that's really important because it recognizes that there's a relationship between the components, as Tim and Chelsea both described, that in the manufacturing of plastic and in some of the really dangerous subcomponents of it, like things like PFAS. And that the more that we understand what those are, the more we hold producers responsible for it, and the quicker we clean it up and prevent it from finding its way into wastewater systems or into our drinking water, the more cost effective it is, and the better it is for ensuring not only human health, and we're protecting human health, but also protecting aquatic life. So I'm going to stop there because we could go on and on. But the last thing I just want to say is, because of the work of the scientists here, the legislators, in partnership with all of you, both in the business sector, creating great innovation, and citizens, we have actually moved light years just in the past 10 years. And we have the opportunity to continue to move in a really positive direction. I am really hopeful that in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe even 4 years, that we're going to see more extended producer responsibility bills passed in the Great Lakes Basin. But it's only going to happen if we all continue to work together, if we pass and advance bills that support things like the IJC monitoring bill and legislation that Chelsea Rochman was talking about. But we can do it, but only if we work together. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We are going to open it up to questions now. And a reminder that if you'd like to ask a question, there's some great ones that are coming in. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to piggyback off the IJC comment that you were making and the monitoring of plastics for our first question. This is a question, maybe Chelsea, that you can help answer, and others. It's about Lake Michigan and what the current assessment is in terms of poor, fair, good, or excellent regarding micro and macro plastics that are in Lake Michigan. And that might be an opportunity to also talk about those gaps that exist and how they can be filled as far as monitoring goes.
Sure. Yeah, so I think I showed a graph that showed the different concentrations that have been reported in all of the different lakes. And I will say that all of that data comes from the academic literature. So to the best of my knowledge, there still is no formal monitoring program for microplastics in the Great Lakes. So your question was specifically about Lake Michigan. And for Lake Michigan, there are samples that cross both thresholds 1 and 2 if that risk assessment was to be adopted. But what governments will need to decide is what percentage of samples have to cross those thresholds to consider the state of Lake Michigan, for example, fair or poor. So basically, the first step that has to happen is microplastics would have to be considered as either a toxic chemical subindicator and or a chemical of mutual concern to turn on that monitoring. And then governments can decide how they want to use these risk assessment frameworks that we are suggesting. So I would say that the preliminary data suggests Lake Michigan would likely be kicked to a fair status. But again, this is going to be for governments to decide. Tim and I were both part of the IJC work group, so our science sort of suggests what they can do, but we don't get to make those decisions about what the thresholds are and how to assign different statuses of health to the Great Lakes.
And I'll jump in real quickly to say, you know, there was a lot of hope that IJC itself would move forward and be able to advance this. And we're not certain, I'll say from afar, that's going to be able to move as quickly as I think many of us were hopeful for. However, my suggestion is and hope is that we're going to see some movement at the state levels and the states that are able to make some movement, and that can continue to, not saying that we don't continue. It's a sort of both and approach, that we begin moving with toxins of concern and establishing the parameters that was established in the IJC report in states where we have the capacity to pass legislation to do that sort of work, and then build a sort of a framework, and especially with the state level departments of environment, and like the Illinois Department and EPA, for example, to be able to establish that and then continue to move forward in case it takes a couple of years for us to get to the really clear recommendations that Chelsea and Tim were able to move forward with. And Senator Fine, I think that's part of the discussion I hope that you know, we can continue to have with your groups.
Thanks very much. This next question comes from Colin, and I think this would be one for Senator Fine and perhaps Andrea as well. What do we know about what the public knows and thinks about plastic in the Great Lakes? What do you encounter when you're talking to your constituents about that or talking in public forums? It seems like, you know, we're talking about the need for more data. We have some data, but need to work on more. And it, you know, Colin's impression is it seems like an issue that many aren't aware of. I'm wondering what your reaction is to that.
I know Andrea can share with you more statistics, but I will tell you that when I talk to constituents and I explain what the problem is, most of them are in shock because most people don't realize that we're getting our clean water, we're getting our fish, you know, the aquatic life. It looks beautiful, it looks pristine, but it's filled with plastic. And when you tell people the statistics of actually how much is there and how much plastics we're consuming, most people are unaware. And when they become aware is when they activate and want to do something about it.
Absolutely. In fact, there was a recent study, so recent that it was just December in 2024, that identified 80% of, and it had a really nice balance of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. So it was a really nicely balanced sampling. 80% of those voters said they supported state and local policies to reduce plastic. And, you know, I also just want to note that I saw some folks making reference to reuse and other solutions. And that's absolutely part of the kind of bills that and the kind of extended producer responsibility solutions that are out there. The work that Senator Fine's doing to address the worst of the worst on things like foam and the bill that's right now in front of the Illinois General Assembly on plastic bags is trying to move us up towards other solutions. This is a multi-year process, and we really hope and we really need everyone's participation in that. But it's a long process, but there's absolutely huge amount of support for this. The other thing that I think is important is, and Tom can talk about this and everyone can look to the report that the Alliance for the Great Lakes came up with. When we bring our volunteers out across the Great Lakes Basin, it is amazing to see their eagerness to engage once they've done a cleanup. Once they've been out there and seen it, and I think this speaks to what Senator Fine was saying, folks want to do more. And we're really eager to help them engage and do more.
Stay tuned. At the end of the call, I will give you that link to sign up for our Adopt a Beach cleanups and also to lead your own. You can also find it on our website at greatlakes.org. So another question, it is along the lines of what we've been talking about. We've talked about eliminating certain categories of plastic, but there's also a need to reduce the use of plastic and replace it with other materials. There was a question is there anything in the works to replace plastic with something more earth conscious, readily available and cheap so that we don't continue to use plastic? There was a related question about perhaps R&D funding that certain governments might be investing in this. But I think this also dovetails with extended producer responsibility and kind of how that works to generate solutions to plastic and reduce plastic use. I'll open that up to the field.
I'll jump in, but if anybody else wants to jump in, one of the things we were just having a conversation about is what's happening in the EU and what's happening in Canada. And Chelsea, maybe you can speak a little bit about what extended producer responsibility looks like in Ontario and Quebec. But you know, when we look at the EU level, we're seeing much more innovation happening because there's been more investment. And we were hoping that we would be able to see some federal investment. I think we're not going to see that in the near future. But I think the reason why I kept talking about public-private partnerships is I'm really hopeful that we can find ways for universities, for private sector folks, even some venture capital folks to start really thinking about how to invest. And there may even be the need for states to consider what that means to jumpstart and put some small investments in there if the federal government is not going to be investing in this for a while. There's going to be many financial challenges out there that's going to be asking for needs in the near future. So I appreciate that. But we really do need there to be movement forward in terms of new solutions. And I've said before, so some folks have heard me say this before, but we live in the center of the country, which is highly agricultural. We're growing things like corn and soybeans and hemp, and the byproducts of those could be used, if intentionally designed, for fabrics and for things that could be replacements for plastics, if done smartly and not done in a way that uses other toxins, right? But we have to do it in a smart way and in a really mindful way. And I'll stop talking now.
Thanks. The next question is for Tim. Tim, Marion asks about some specific research that you're doing in the North Branch of the Chicago River and your 3-year monitoring study, what you've been seeing there, and if that work will be continuing.
Yeah, we've focused a lot of our work for rivers on trash in the Chicago River because it's so convenient for us and because there's a lot of trash there. We're interested in trying to understand the sources and the fate of trash as it relates to stormwater. So this is a project I've been working on Chelsea with as well, where we know that storms are really an important time for when trash is coming into our waterways. And then it's also an important time when it's remobilized and kind of brought up from the bottom and shaken out of the trees and shifted downstream. And so our work has quantified this explicitly to say, yes, that storms are where about 80% of the movement of the plastic is happening as it relates to like downstream export to the Great Lakes or to the oceans. And that if we want to understand how to prevent that redistribution or try to capture the plastic, we need to have devices or policies that really consider these extreme weather events as the key time periods. And this is confounded by climate change. We know that in this part of the world, we're going to expect greater sort of intensity of precipitation. And we need to be prepared for this for things like flooding and protecting people and businesses and homes and property, but also for consideration of how our pollutants are moving through our waterways. So we're still underway. We're still working on that study and finalizing some of our papers.
Thanks so much. There's questions about microplastics. We've talked about microplastics in water. Do water reclamation plants monitor microplastics, and do water filtration systems, are they effective enough to remove microplastics from drinking water?
I can speak to that a little bit. I don't think any drinking water treatment plants monitor for microplastics as part of their programming the way they might for other contaminants or chemicals. In the state of California, they did have a policy that was passed that said that they needed to, but what they decided to do was to do sort of a study where they had different agencies sample and test their water to try to figure out the best method. I know there are people that have piecemeal looked at microplastics in drinking water that have been pulled from the Great Lakes, and it is there, but I think there's that question of, can water treatment plants, can we filter them out? And the answer is yes. I think the best thing to do at home is to use an RO system, reverse osmosis, at home, which will stop the particles before it lands in your cup of water. Because otherwise, a lot of the treatment that happens at the wastewater treatment, or sorry, my drinking water friends get really mad at me when I call it wastewater. The drinking water treatment plants is that sometimes it'll, the filters will take care of it, but then you get microplastic as it comes in the pipe. So if you want to be microplastic free, I would do the filtering at home.
Thanks so much. This one asks us to look a little bit in the crystal ball of the future of legislation. This comes from Carol. What kinds of legislation or plastic bans do you think most likely to be introduced and pass? What is the most likely pushback against the legislation? And Carol didn't specify exactly where, but let's think about the Great Lakes Basin, or maybe if Illinois feels like easier, we can limit it to that too.
So in Illinois, we've been very proactive on these plastic bans. I think we were the first state to ban microplastics in soaps and cosmetics. And that was a very exciting start. What we have to remember is each state is kind of like a petri dish. And when you experiment in one state and it works, other states are going to try it. So even though Illinois right now is, I believe, the 11th or 12th state, I think depending on when the bill is passed and signed, I think we're competing with Montana for that number to have banned polystyrene and styrene products. Once other states see that it's possible, they sort of jump on the bandwagon and do the same thing. So, although we're working on this bill now, we're working on the plastic ban bag that Andrea was talking about, and we also have some PFAS legislation that's pending. What we will do after this session ends on May 31st is sort of take a look at what we were able to accomplish and see where we need to go next. So we'll look to see, what have other states done? What are other ideas? I know we always work with our environmental partners to figure out what is our best path forward. So what our next bills are at this point, quite sure. Maybe Andrea would have more insight on that than I would, but we are going to keep trucking forward and make sure Illinois is the beacon when it comes to protecting our waterways.
And the only thing I'll say to add on to that, I mean, that's exactly, that's right. And obviously, and we try to be really mindful. I mean, I described looking at what other extended producer responsibilities were out there, and that these bills, especially these bills addressing the worst of the worst, we're trying to tackle them first in order to build the opportunities for us to move towards passing an extended producer responsibility bill in Illinois, but also to think about and I also talked about the PFAS and microplastic working group bill that we're looking at and working on this year. We're trying to do pieces that sort of walk and chew gum at the same time, pieces that look at trying to understand what the problem is, as well as address the worst and the worst, and then set us up for building even more structural solutions over time. And then having conversations with states and legislators. And Austin, and I just want to just highlight this because we are really unusual in the Great Lakes Basin. Our legislators talk with each other more than almost anybody else across the country, and they talk with each other across binationally, which means that the reason why I keep noting what's happening in Ontario and Quebec is that Senator Fine gets to learn from her colleagues in Quebec and Ontario, and they've been doing this longer than we have, which means that we get to learn from that. They've been doing that. They've been our petri dish, and we get to step ahead from what they're doing. And we're really, really honored to be able to work in a region that works so closely together in such a collaborative fashion. And that means we're going to be able to advance faster and smarter.
I have a question maybe for Chelsea and Tim. It's about the movement of plastics in the Great Lakes. So is there a way to discern where plastic waste, perhaps that is found at beach cleanups or that washes on shore, as an example, is coming from? And is there a pattern of movement of plastics through the Great Lakes?
Tim, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can start with the composition and maybe you can speak to the movement. You know, we've looked at the trash that's collected by the volunteers who sign up for these beach cleanups, which is wonderful. And a lot of the trash that we find on our beaches is are fragments and then single-use materials, food, drinking, smoking, and I'm including cigarette butts in that too. So these are things that people like to do on the beach or perhaps on a boat. And so we think a lot of the trash that we find on the beach comes from people at the beach, rather than it being transported over really long distances. Another key feature of our Great Lakes beach trash is it looks different than what people find on ocean beaches. Specifically, we don't get a lot of fishing material like big nets and hooks or traps, and we don't get a lot of shipping container style materials either. Obviously, that's much more predominant in the ocean, and it means that we don't have to worry about those kinds of litter types as much in the Great Lakes. And what it means ultimately is that the trash on our beaches is coming from us. You know, it's coming from inside the house, so to speak. And what it means is that we can have local solutions that can be effective. We don't have to think about what's going on in a bunch of other countries in the world, like countries who have ocean beaches do. We can think about what's going on in our communities and really make a difference. But I know Chelsea's done some work to track trash.
Yeah, so we had a project last year where we were tagging bottles, and I think Tim, you must have put these in the Chicago River as well. And we were looking at where the bottles went, and then once they ended in the lake, where did they go? And I think one thing that was interesting is plastic in the river certainly moves through the river, especially when it rains, although sometimes it does get hung up on woody debris and other materials. But once in the environment, I think the most interesting thing for us, at least in Toronto Harbor, is that a lot of it just bounced around within the harbor, which meant that if we were, had trash capture devices on our watershed, or we were doing cleanups, we were cleaning up our own local debris. And so we had this opportunity to actually remove it from the water, monitor, and use that data to inform some of that upstream or preventative solution. So, sure, we had a couple of bottles shoot across the lake. We had one end up in New York, but for the most part, a lot of the litter we have here is from here. It is our litter. So.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great transition to what you can do to get involved. I am going to put it into the chat here in just 1 second. There are a lot of different ways that folks can get involved. You can sign up for our email list with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. That's the way to stay most up to date on what's happening with plastics in the Great Lakes. You can sign up for one of our Adopt a Beach cleanups. We've talked about those. You can reach out to your Illinois legislator if you live in the state of Illinois to write them and tell them to support some of the bills that we've talked about today. And then finally, we are a nonprofit, and we would love it if you would consider supporting our work with a donation using that link there. Thank you to all of our panelists, Senator Fine, Andrea, Chelsea, Tim. This has been an incredibly informative conversation, and we've had a tremendous amount of interest. We will be following up with an email that has a link to this video and some of these resources. So again, I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thank you all so much for joining.